Chapter 27. John stepped closer to Cameron, at the table inside the shed, tinkering with something. There were tools and random pieces of metal set out on the table, and it was clear she'd been up to something. He wanted to believe Cameron when she'd said she didn't kill Riley. He really did. But things did go wrong with her. He saw a small chain in her hand and approached, curious. "What have you been doing?" "You've been out here for hours." Cameron turned to him, holding something small and silver in her hands. "Making something," she said, her voice soft as it always was when she spoke to him. He tried not to think about what that could imply. "For you." She pushed the object gently into his hands, piquing his curiosity. "What is it?" he asked as he looked down at it. It was an old pocket watch. What had she been doing out here for hours with an old antique? It had been polished and looked quite good, he had to admit. Maybe it was her idea of a present. "You tried to fix me twice now," Cameron replied, looking straight at him. John tried to read the expression on her face, but there was nothing discernible there. It wasn't blank, but whatever it was she was showing, he couldn't tell what it was. "It's not working." John felt a tinge of worry creep into him as she spoke. What was she trying to tell him? "And I'm not capable of self-termination," Cameron told him without hesitation. "Suicide. I can't kill myself, but you can." John's eyes widened, not believing what he was hearing from her, and he did a double take at her words. What was going on in her chip? He shook his head adamantly in denial. "Why would I want to kill you?" He'd been pissed off with her plenty, sure, and he wanted her to leave him alone and give him some space, but he didn't want anything to happen to her. You might have to someday. He opened the watch, knowing just what she meant. She was worried she'd go bad and try to kill him again, and she was giving him the means to stop her if it happened, placing her life in his hands. The soldier nodded and ran out of the door, disappearing into the din and leaving Kyle alone with John. "You led them here," he pointed a finger at John. He'd been willing to hear John out, even heard his crazy story about time travel and humored him, but Derek was right. The kid was definitely working for Skynet, had led the machines right to them. He picked John up by the lapels of his jacket, lifted him off the chair, and slammed him back into the wall. "You bastard," he snarled. Flecks of spittle flew into John's face. "You killed us, John. You. If we make it through this, we're gonna nail you to the goddamn wall." John watched his not-father raging at him, murder in his eyes, but he didn't say a word in his own defense. Anything he said now would just incriminate him further. Another explosion rocked outside, and Kyle looked backwards as the door to their room blew open. John saw no choice. Even if they dealt with the machine, he'd be their next target. They'd never believe he was innocent now. He pushed forward and screamed out in rage as he slammed his forehead into Kyle's nose. The younger Reese cried out in shock and stepped backwards, but John slammed his fists against Kyle's face and stomach, shoved him against the wall and kneed him hard in the balls, doubling him over as pain racked his body. John brought his elbow down on crown of Kyle's head, and the man who wasn't his father dropped to the floor with a low groan and lay still. "I'm sorry," John muttered as he fished through Kyle's pockets. He found a flashlight in one thigh pocket and pulled it out. He pulled the door aside, slipped out and saw flashes of plasma fire, and explosions flared through the large main chamber, and the machine was instantly obvious. Half its face was missing, and a bright blue orb glowed brightly in the darkened basement. The sight of the Terminator stopped him in its tracks. It wasn't the hulking monster he'd been expecting. This one was shorter, slimmer, feminine. "Cameron!" He gaped, aghast at the sight of her gunning down Derek and his men without mercy. No. No. This wasn't right at all. Half her face was gone, but the one side still covered in flesh was clearly her. Her hair stuck out, frazzled and unkempt. Her organic eye looked to him, wide open and afraid, pleading even while the exposed blue machine orb glared at him coldly as she pointed a pair of plasma rifles at him and fired. Blue-white light flashed all around John, and everything went dark. John watched from Serrano Point's perimeter fence as Ellison ran back to Kyle and started dragging him towards their exit. "Come on," he shouted out, urging them onward. He wanted to go and help, but Cameron had one hand on his webbing, and he knew she wouldn't let him risk himself like that. With a strength belied by his age, Ellison heaved John's not-father closer and closer to them. "Come on," John muttered, willing them to move faster. "Come on." Jet engines roared from above, and John looked up with immediate dread as an HK soared above the main complex and cast its search beam down on Kyle and Ellison's. But it wasn't Ellison anymore. Cameron stood alone in the harsh glare of the beam and looked upwards. "Run!" He screamed at her as hard as he could. But Cameron remained rooted to the spot, either not hearing or not listening to him. "Run!" The world slowed down to a crawl as the HK's plasma cannon swiveled in her direction, and John's heart went berserk in his chest. Cameron was in its line of fire. He swung his weapon up at the machine, but it weighed a ton. It was so heavy in his hands, and he struggled to bear it upwards at the mechanical bird of prey. His arms burned and shook as he fought to shoulder the weapon and aim it upwards, taking every ounce of strength he had. He held down the trigger, and his shots burst out the rifle. Plasma erupted from the cannon at the same time and streaked into Cameron's position, followed by shot after shot as the weapon carpet-bombed her position. Its plasma cannon unleashed a hailstorm of blue-white bolts that hammered the ground around them, consuming Cameron in roiling flames mixed in with explosions of dirt thrown in all directions like a volcanic eruption, as John's world fell apart in slow motion, his heart torn from his chest and ripped to shreds. She reached out through the fires as her flesh burnt from her endoskeleton, her blue glowing eyes staring at him, pleading for him to come to her. "Help me," she cried out as the last traces of flesh were seared from her, revealing just the bare metal bones beneath. The fires raged even higher, brighter, too hot even for her to withstand. John watched, helpless as she collapsed to the ground. Somehow he could see her through the flames. Her chassis smoldering and glowing white-hot, her glowing blue eyes flickered. One exploded and remained dim, and the other blinked erratically as Cameron reached one hand out towards him, begging for help before another blast from the HK conflagrated the fires, engulfing her in an instant, burning her away into nothing. "Cameron!" John shot up out of bed and grabbed for a rifle that wasn't there. "Cameron!" He looked around and saw she wasn't there. He heard footsteps outside and recognized the sound of her light but mechanical march as she still patrolled outside. He breathed in deeply in relief and sighed out as he collapsed back onto the mattress. It was soaked through, he realized immediately. He could feel sweat dripping off his temples, his neck and his chest, and running down his back, and his heart pounded painfully inside his chest, and despite having just been asleep, he was almost breathless. What the hell was that? He breathed. He knew full well what it was. The start of the nightmares that would haunt him for a long time to come, and the prospect of it filled him with dread. He remembered the talk with Cameron the night before, how she'd still worried about going bad. That had happened in the dream. She'd been the one slaughtering through Derek's tunnel. And she'd been killed by the HK, but that had been Ellison and Kyle, not her. Where the hell had that come from? Weak light filtered through the thin curtains, and he peeled them away from the corner of the window. The top of the sun was just poking above the horizon and cast an orange hue over the desert. He didn't have a watch on him, but he guessed it was around 5 a.m. or so. It was just barely dawn anyway. Nobody else would be up for at least an hour, but no way did he want to go back to bed. He didn't want to sleep again, knowing what horrible things were waiting for him in his dreams. He got up off the sweat-soaked bed, grabbed a towel and padded out of his room and into the bathroom. He was hot and cold at the same time, slimy and covered in sweat. He looked into the mirror and saw a sheen of perspiration across his forehead, neck, chest, and shoulders. He switched the shower on and waited a few moments for the water to heat up before he stepped into the tub and pulled the curtain back over him. The hot water cascaded over him and sluiced the sweat and dirt of the desert off his body. It would have felt supremely good on his skin, but he barely even noticed it. All he could think of was the dream, seeing Cameron being consumed in glowing flames and blasted apart by plasma. It scared him, terrified him right down to the core. He leaned against the wall and bowed his head under the torrent of water, letting it wash over him. It cleaned his body, but did nothing for his mind. Confusion clouded his brain, and he found it hard to think straight as he remembered the dream in horrible clarity. He'd been constantly on the go for months. Since Riley had died and he'd confronted Jesse, things had gone from bad to worse. Losing their home and all but living rough. Seeing Charlie die, watching Derek getting shot in the head, his mom being arrested, and worst of all, losing Cameron. He'd fought tooth and nail every minute of every day in the future to find her. Just staying alive had been a struggle, and he'd had to kill once again to survive. He'd seen and done things more horrible than he could ever imagine, and the idea of history repeating itself again caused John to start shaking as he leaned against the wall. It was all too much for him. He'd told his mom he'd been through hell in the future, but hell was just a word. The reality had been much, much worse. Whilst he was there, he hadn't had the time to think. He'd either been hiding, on the run, or on the offensive. Now he was back and things had stabilized once again. The memories rushed back to him. The man he'd killed, the people he'd watched perish, and those he'd led to their deaths. The sheer horror, death and destruction on a global scale started to sink in now. He was relatively safe and was no longer busy. Fuck. John shook his head slowly as it all built up inside him. He clenched his fists and punched the wall hard, cutting his knuckle on a piece of tile sticking out. He barely noticed it as tears started to flow from his eyes, invisible amongst the shower spray pouring down onto him. He didn't try to wipe away the water or his own tears, and just remained leaning against the wall. He didn't know how long it was before he felt the hot pain in his hand and saw the trickle of blood from the top of his hand. Droplets of water splashed against it and diluted the deep crimson liquid, thinning it out and running onto the floor of the tub. The shower curtain suddenly slid along the rail and pulled aside. John turned around in surprise and saw Cameron, completely naked, step into the shower with him. He took in her nude form as the water ran over her, pebbling up her soft pink nipples and hardening them as he looked at her, and found himself growing aroused as well as confused as to what she was doing. Cameron took a step towards him and closed the gap between their bodies. She saw the cut on his knuckles and took his hand gently in hers, inspecting it. She'd returned from her patrol to find the room empty and the bed soaked in his sweat. She'd been waiting for him to finish when she'd heard a bang against the wall. He'd taken significantly longer than he normally did for a shower, and she'd decided to investigate. "What are you doing?" John asked her, still watching her naked form like a hawk, but he looked up to see the look of concern on her face as she ran the pad of her thumb over his knuckles. She held it up to the water, so the spray washed away the blood that slowly seeped out, and laced her fingers with his for a moment. "You shouldn't be alone." She let go of his hand and reached to the side for the shampoo, without ever taking her eyes away from his. She squirted some out onto her free hand and started to knead it into his hair, working up lather, and at the same time, she meticulously massaged his scalp with her fingertips. John closed his eyes and moaned quietly, just under his breath, as she continued to work. "Feels good," he smiled at her. "Close your eyes," she told him. John complied, and Cameron pushed him back gently until his head was directly under the shower head, rinsing the lather out. She turned him around so his back was to her, and when she was satisfied all the shampoo was gone, she continued her ministrations on his neck and shoulders, gently but firmly kneading out all the knots and working the stress away. She knew she was doing it right when he sighed contentedly, and even though he couldn't see it, she smiled. She leaned forward and kissed the back of his neck as she continued to massage him. John began to relax, and Cameron sensed his heart rate and blood pressure dropping, which came as a relief to her. She'd seen the soaked sheets, and she'd known what had happened. Future John often had nightmares, and when she'd done laundry in their old house, Derek's sheets had often been clammy and saturated with sweat. She decided that she would now permanently sleep in his bed with him at night. He'd been comfortable and slept soundly, undisturbed in the motel. The night before their mission to Serrano Point, John had unconsciously moved closer to her when he'd been asleep. She realized that he sought comfort in her presence, in being close to her, and she decided that John wouldn't sleep alone again. "I didn't think Terminators had files on massaging," John said, arching his back as Cameron unknotted the tension in his shoulders. "We don't," she replied. "This is my first one. You're really good at it." Cameron frowned as she continued to work. His vital signs belied his words. His pulse increased, as did his blood pressure. Massages were supposed to be relaxing. Am I doing it wrong? John turned back towards her, and she instantly saw as she looked down that she'd been wrong in her conclusion. She hadn't been doing it wrong, far from it. He stepped towards her and pulled Cameron close, embracing her in a tight hug and lowering his head to her. He felt the pain, the anger and the fear wash away in Cameron's embrace as he kissed her. Something inside him snapped, and he pushed her against the wall, right underneath the shower nozzle. She felt something hard poke against her belly and knew what he wanted. In one move, John lifted Cameron up, pinned her against the wall and kissed her harder. Their mouths opened and their tongues intertwined and caressed each other as he lifted her up higher, lining himself up with her. Cameron cupped his face in her hands and held him in place, enjoying kissing John with the ferocity they were as she lifted her legs up and wrapped them around his waist. He pulled back 1 second and looked into her eyes, holding her in place against the wall. "Are you just doing this to make me feel better?" he asked, remembering what she'd told him before. Sex didn't really do anything for her. "Is it working?" she inquired casually with a cocked eyebrow, answering his question with another. He couldn't help but smile as he held her up and looked at her. Her hair was soaked through, and the water made her skin glisten. She's beautiful, he thought. Her answer mulled around in his mind. All she wanted was to protect him and make him okay. She cared nothing for herself, he realized. Her love for him was truly selfless. "I love you." Their lips mashed hard together, and their tongues danced once more as John pressed his chest against her breasts, feeling her hard nipples poking into his skin as she wrapped her legs around him. John lifted her up higher and pushed into her center, gasping at the molten heat, and the memories of their night in the motel came rushing back to him. She sighed against his mouth and stroked his back as they moved and thrust against each other. They were too busy kissing for her to tell him she loved him too, but people often said actions spoke louder than words. She sighed happily against his lips as they moved in perfect union. The sun burned low in the sky and shone brightly down onto the desert below. Even though it was still early morning, the air was already warm, and by the afternoon would be stifling. Strong beams of light cast down onto the small safe house in the Mojave, filtered through the thin, cheap, dated curtains of Sarah's window and lit up the room, casting a bright, warm glow against the walls. Patches where the material of the curtains had worn thin or been eaten by moths caused the sun's rays to cast patterns on the wall, which moved as they swayed slightly in the gentle breeze from the open window. All of this was lost on Sarah, however. If the weather had suddenly changed to a thundering storm, she'd have barely noticed. So intent she was on the task at hand. Her stomach burned terribly, and every muscle in her abdomen ached, trembled, and threatened to fail as she pulled herself up, straining hard. Only inches to go. Her elbows touched her bent knees, and she exhaled deeply in relief as her stomach relaxed, and she collapsed back down onto the floor, the fifth set of 50 sit-ups complete. She lay on the floor and felt the sun on her face as she breathed deeply and slowly, recovering from her morning workout. Sit-ups, press-ups, dips, and squats had left her whole body burning, but she felt good. Except for her parched mouth and throat. "Water," she said to herself as she rolled onto her front and pushed herself upright. She got to her feet and stepped out of her room, instantly hearing the shower running off to her left. She was curious as to who else would be up at this time. It wasn't even 6 a.m. yet, and John normally slept in late, so it couldn't be him. She ignored it and turned right into the kitchen, where she opened the cupboard and pulled out a bottle of water, unscrewing the cap and lifting it to her lips. They didn't have a refrigerator, only a larder, so the water was lukewarm, but it did the job anyway and helped quench her thirst. She turned out of the kitchen and headed back towards her room. She'd start on breakfast soon later, thinking he'd want to have a decent meal when he got up. Normally, he'd skip breakfast as most teenagers did, but after seeing him tear last night's dinner in record time, she didn't doubt he'd be ready and waiting for any meal going. As Sarah stepped through the passage, she realized the shower had stopped. The doorknob turned and opened, and the door opened inwards to reveal Cameron, wearing only a towel wrapped around her that barely concealed the top of her breasts and ran down only a few inches below her crotch. Her hair was wet and her skin pink from the hot water, and a few droplets still clung onto her here and there. "You should probably cover up before someone sees you," Sarah told her as Cameron stepped out of the bathroom, followed a second later by John. Her son stepped out beside Cameron, his hair also wet, skin just as flushed, and leaving no doubt that they'd both showered together, and she had a feeling that it hadn't been so save water. What the hell? She glared at John and then at Cameron, feeling her already intense animosity towards the machine ratchet up to another level. "John, how could you be so stupid?" She shook her head. This couldn't be happening. She knew her son had feelings for the machine, but to have actually had sex with it. To her, that was like falling in love with a farm animal or a pet and sleeping with that. Less, even, as Cameron wasn't actually alive. He might as well have screwed the toaster. "He's not stupid," Cameron started to reply. John put his hand on her shoulder, halting her, and calmly stepped forward, stopping when he was beside her. He took her hand in his and laced their fingers together, catching his mom's eyes as she looked down at their entwined digits. "I'll handle it," he said to her. He turned to Sarah and looked at her evenly. "You know I love Cameron." He knew his mom was pretty switched on. She'd have known all along, surely, he thought. "You're a teenager, John. You don't know what love is." The look he gave her back was so cold, it could have frozen the sun, and it chilled Sarah to the bone. "So what was it when you were with Kyle?" John asked, his eyes narrowing. "In the few hours we had together, we loved a lifetime's worth. A few hours, a day and a half at most. I was in the future for 3 months, looking for Cameron. You tell me which one's love and which isn't." He stared at his mom, challenging her for an answer. He'd been through hell to get Cameron back, and he wasn't going to shy away from why he did it now. Sarah tried to say something, to make a reply, but she was dumbstruck. It stung her badly to hear him all but say that what she'd had with Kyle wasn't love. To her it was, the only man she'd ever loved, and his father to boot. Comparing what she'd had with Kyle to what he'd done, with the machine added insult to injury. "She can't love you back," Sarah finally settled on. "I do," Cameron insisted. Because you're programmed to, Sarah argued back. You'd die for John because that's your job. Cameron shook her head, disagreeing vehemently. She'd learned a lot about herself recently, and her discussion with John last night had made her realize that Sarah was extremely wrong. I haven't been programmed to protect John since his 16th birthday. I love John and he loves me. Your opinion's irrelevant. She's right, Mom, John added, still holding her hand for emphasis. I don't need your permission. I love Cameron and nothing's going to change that. He stopped, realizing how harsh he sounded now. He'd made his point, and he didn't want to be at odds with his mom. He'd missed her when he'd gone to the future, and he didn't want to lose her again. But I hope you'll accept it, he said. One day. Sarah looked to her son, then at Cameron. She could see a trace of possessiveness in the cyborg, how she clutched onto John's hand, not hard, but she could tell that Cameron wasn't going to let go. She'd seen how close they were, before and after John's jump to the future, and when she thought about it, she knew how futile it was trying to talk John out of it. He'd risked life, limb, and the fate of the entire world to find her in the future. She'd never liked how close he'd been to her, how he responded to Cameron, but clearly at some point things had developed even further between them, and the bond was now unbreakable. Maybe one day, she sighed, resigned. God, she groaned inwardly, how she hated the cyborg. She certainly didn't want Cameron as a proverbial daughter-in-law, but she could see she really had no choice. It was like it or lump it, and she wasn't going to lose John again. If she had to play it his way, so be it. She'd try to for him, but she'd never, ever like it. I don't want it thrown in my face, she said to both of them. You keep the physical stuff behind closed doors. We can do that, Cameron said amicably. She didn't care if Sarah disapproved, but she knew that John wanted his mother's acceptance. It was unlikely he'd ever receive it. And put some clothes on, Sarah snapped, regaining a semblance of authority again. I don't want Savannah coming out here and seeing you two naked. Or Danny, John couldn't help saying. I don't think he's seen a naked girl before. I doubt it, Cameron agreed. That makes 3 of us, Sarah said. So get dressed before that changes and he has a heart attack. John nodded and led Cameron back into their room, and Sarah went back to hers and sat hunched on the edge of her bed. She took out her Glock, pulled out the magazine and ejected the chambered round. She quickly disassembled it and started to clean it, finding the routine and the smell of the oil she used to lubricate the working parts therapeutic. They helped her to put the ugly sight of her son and Cameron together out of her mind, almost. Why couldn't John fall for a proper girl? She knew the answer to that. No normal girl could share his life, now or ever. Even if they stopped at all, they'd be on the run, and John could never reveal who he really was, couldn't talk about his past with anyone. She pulled the top slide off and started to clear dust out of it, and threaded a cloth through the barrel. The worst part about it all was that when she thought about John, with cold, hard logic, then Cameron was his best bet. There was no need to pretend he was just a normal guy with her. She was a part of their struggle against Skynet. She'd never leave him for another guy, never cheat on him, never break his heart, and she'd always be there for him. When she really thought about it, Cameron was the perfect companion for John, and it made her sick to her stomach just thinking about it. Unfucking believable, she muttered. It was times like this, even years since she'd quit smoking, that she'd give her right arm for a cigarette and a drink, a big drink. The smell of cooking beans and sausages wafted through the small kitchen, and the aroma teased John's senses as he automatically started to salivate. Cameron stood at the small gas oven and stirred a saucepan. The beans, sausages, and tomatoes were all tinned, but he didn't care. He was happy just to eat whatever was put in front of him, and Cameron was happy to cook it for him. When she deemed it ready, she spooned the food onto a plate and walked over to the table, placing it in front of John and running her hand over his shoulders as she passed by him and took a seat at his right. John instantly grabbed his knife and fork and started in on it, shoveling the food into his mouth with vigor. He'd built up an appetite this morning. He grinned inwardly. Thanks, he smiled to Cameron. Not just for the food, he thought. He'd been falling apart this morning, and she'd put him back together. She gave a small, subtle smile back, and her eyes brightened for a moment as she met his gaze. Seeing his smile made her immensely satisfied. All she wanted was for him to be safe and happy. His smile faded when he turned to Ellison, and Savannah sat opposite. So you've got to do this job for Malenkov, and then he tells you what he knows about Knowles. John asked. He'd hardly believed it when Ellison had told him he and Savannah had to split off from the rest of them and head back into L.A. He didn't know what to think of this Malenkov guy. Ellison knew him, but although John had trusted Ellison in the future, he didn't know this arms dealer. He'd met plenty as a kid, though, and they'd all been bastards to the extreme. They generally weren't to be trusted. What's the job? We don't know, Savannah said warily, between mouthfuls of her own sausage and beans. She'd come into the kitchen when Cameron had been cooking John's breakfast. Cameron had offered to make some for her when she'd finished, but Savannah didn't have the patience to wait. She'd opened up a can of all-day breakfast and dug into it cold. Admittedly, she hadn't been too happy when Ellison had told her Malenkov wanted her to do the job today, but she didn't see any other choice. And you're happy with this? John asked her. A blind commitment to a random job. Savannah shrugged and ate another forkful of sausage and beans. Malenkov had said it wasn't anything sexual, and she'd hold him to that. If it gets us one step closer to Skynet, she replied. That's gotta be worth whatever the job is. I don't like it, Sarah said as she entered the room, went straight to the coffee maker and poured herself a mug. She remained standing up and leaned against the wall, staring at Cameron out the corner of her eye. She'd said to John she'd try and tolerate it, but she'd make no secret that she didn't like what was going on. I don't either, Cameron added, agreeing with Sarah. He might be lying. If he was then, she knew how to deal with him. He's never once lied to me. Ellison shook his head and sipped his own coffee. He hadn't bothered with breakfast, not feeling particularly hungry. He turned to Sarah. He could have screwed us over with the weapons, but he didn't. He's an arms dealer, Sarah shot back. A criminal, not exactly the kind of guy we should trust. And we're terrorists, John said to her. At least, they were according to the government. We're right up there with Bin Laden now, minus the beard. He wasn't happy about relying on someone else, someone he didn't know, but he'd trusted Ellison in the future and he'd do the same now. There was another consideration he'd thought of, but hadn't mentioned yet. He's an international arms dealer. If we can't stop Judgment Day, then we can at least make sure we're stocked up with enough weapons to fight back. We might need him. He could be an important ally, Cameron agreed. So you agree with us now? Savannah asked him. John nodded. You sold me, he said. Go and meet him, see what the job is. If it's too dangerous, don't take it, he told her. Whatever Malenkov had better be worth it, he thought. He turned to his mom, sipping coffee out of her mug. I need you to stay here with Savannah. Cameron and I are gonna run an errand with Danny. Sure, Sarah shrugged nonchalantly, though inside she found herself confused as to what was going on here. Ellison and Savannah were going on an unknown mission to secure a very vague potential lead. John and Cameron were taking Danny somewhere, and she'd been demoted to a stay-at-home mom, whilst others did the fighting on the front line. She'd started to accept that John was now running the show, but now she found herself as just the tea lady, and she didn't like it one bit. Knowles stepped into the store and let the door swing closed behind him. A small bell on the top of the door chimed as it closed, announcing his entry into the small establishment. He glanced around and saw rows upon rows of rifles and shotguns lining the walls, secured on wooden shelves. He approached one shelf and peered at the various weapons in front of him, glancing over a variety of shotguns and hunting rifles. He'd been driving aimlessly when he'd decided on his next course of action. He was going to go back to Kaliba and smash their AI to pieces. But there was only two things. He corrected himself standing in the way: Baldy and steroids. Both of them were cyborgs, and from what he'd read about the latter's raid on the police station in 1984, they'd both be tough and armored. He didn't know if the 5.56mm in his HKG-36 would be enough or not. The problem was he knew so little about these things, and he had no way of making contact with Sarah Connor to find out. "Can I help you?" A short, gray-haired man in jeans and a pale blue shirt stepped out from the counter and approached him. "What are you looking for? Home defense or hunting?" The question caught him off guard. What kind of weapon did he really want? Ideally an Abrams tank, but he doubted the old guy had one of those out back. He'd driven to Nevada because he couldn't get a weapon in California without having to wait for 10 days whilst he was put through background checks, which would undoubtedly flag him up on Skynet's radar. Whereas in Nevada, he could buy a weapon and walk out the store with it, no questions asked. He looked around the store and thought about it for a moment. Chances were pissy little NATO rounds wouldn't do much, nor would buckshot or handgun rounds. "Hunting," Knowles replied. He didn't know what would kill these cyborgs, but he knew from reading that they wouldn't go down easy. The attendant pushed his glasses up further on his nose and nodded knowingly. He pulled a shotgun off the rack and held it in front of him. Winchester 1300, 12 gauge, takes 7 rounds, and it's one of the fastest cycling pump-action shotguns there is. He handed it to Knowles, who took it, pumped the slide and dry-fired the weapon, earning a satisfying click as he pulled the trigger. He pretended to admire the polished wooden finish on the thing, but really his thoughts weren't on the aesthetics or even on the weapon itself anymore. He'd spotted something better. He put the Winchester down and stepped up to a rack of rifles. He pulled out a polished M1 Garand rifle. This'd be a hell of a lot better, he thought. He knew the M1 was in the 7.62mm range. It'd do a lot better than his G36. "Is this 308 or .06? .06, he replied. "You interested?" "How much?" Knowles asked eagerly, fingering the weapon. He pulled it to his shoulder and looked down the barrel. "This could do." He gave a slight grin. $850, the owner said. "Done," Knowles agreed. He turned back to the shotgun again, figuring the more weapons the better. "What about ammo?" he asked. He didn't know much about shotguns or hunting rifles, and had no idea about their ammunition, though he reckoned buckshot would be like a pea shooter against the machines. He wanted something that might stand a chance of punching a hole through the bastards. "What animal are you hunting?" For a second, Knowles was tempted to say light armored vehicle and see what the guy would recommend, but refrained from it. He had to think about the machines he was going to put himself up against. Even though he had no clue what could do it, he had to come up with something. "Big game," he said. "Biggest you can imagine. Bison, elk?" "Forget buckshot then," the attendant replied. He carried the Winchester to the counter and pulled out a box of shells, opening it and taking one out. "Solid steel slugs. This'll take down whatever you shoot it at." "I hope so," Knowles thought to himself. The game in question was bigger than the old man could imagine. "I'll take it," he nodded at the Winchester. "How many slugs are in a box?" 10. "Give me 5 boxes," he said to the clerk. He had half a dozen mags of 5.56mm. If that, plus the .06s and 50 rounds of these didn't do the trick, then chances were nothing on the civilian market would. "What I wouldn't give for a proper machine gun," he thought. Anything else?" the attendant asked. Knowles looked around at the handgun selection, wondering if it was really worth it. Police issue 9mm, buckshot and 5.56mm had done fuck all to steroids, according to the reports from 1984, so would anything else really work? He decided against it. Chances were pistols would be useless. He'd stick with what he had and just hope it'd work. 100 rounds of .06, he said. The old guy pulled the boxes of ammunition from the shelf behind him and put them into a bag. He told him how much it all cost, but he didn't really listen. Knowles just handed his credit card over and automatically entered his PIN. Moments later, he mumbled thanks, walked out the store with his brand new guns and the boxes of ammunition, put them all in the car with his bag containing the assault rifle, and drove off, heading west back towards California. He had the weapons, the ammunition. All he needed now was a plan of action. The home of Sasha Malenkov, Savannah thought as she and Ellison approached the front door, must be one of the most secure locations outside of the military. A large mansion in a gated community in Beverly Hills. It was part palace, part fortress. They'd had to be cleared by one of his bodyguards who'd been waiting for them at the entrance. And then they'd been driven through the affluent private neighborhood to his home, past immaculate, huge houses that she thought must belong to movie stars and singers and the like. The house itself was surrounded by a 10-foot-high wall. There was nothing but flat, well-kept grass between it and the house, ensuring anyone who did manage to scale the wall would have no cover on their approach. She saw motion sensors on the walls of the house that would be linked to lights, illuminating anyone who did approach at night, and chances were, she thought, that it also connected to an alarm system. "This place must have cost a fortune," she said in awe at the place. Behind it was a large back garden, and she could see the edge of a swimming pool behind the house. $4.2 million, the bodyguard replied in a heavy Slavic accent. Unlike the previous goons they'd met, however, this man looked like he spent a lot of his time in the gym and sunbathing, and had characteristically Slavic high-chiseled cheekbones and shoulder-length, slicked-back hair. "Nice if you can afford it," she said. "You used to live in a place like this," Ellison commented. In fact, Catherine Weaver's house made Malenkov's appear humble in comparison. "Yeah, but that was so long ago I barely remember it," she replied. At the front of the house was a black limousine with darkened windows at the rear of the vehicle. The bodyguard opened the front door and ushered them inside. The interior was just as opulent as the outside. Marble floors, polished oak furniture, and gilding. They passed a pair of men in suits, with a bulge sticking out under their jackets, hinting that they were both armed. Ellison wondered how many men Malenkov had in his security detail. He was better protected than the leaders of some small countries. One thing Ellison noted was that they'd not been searched like they had been previously. Not that he needed to, he thought. Even if they'd been armed to the teeth, they'd never successfully attack anyone here and get out alive. It'd be a good safe house, he thought. "Welcome," Malenkov boomed from the top of a polished wooden staircase. He came down to greet them and led them into his living room. A 60-inch LCD TV hung up on one wall, but it was off, and the screen blank, and dominating the room was a large, leather corner sofa opposite the TV. "Please, sit," Malenkov gestured to the sofa, and the pair of them sat down and sank into the soft cushions. Malenkov sat on the other side and faced them. "Would you like anything to drink?" He asked them politely. "We won't be here long enough for that," Savannah said curtly. She wanted to just get on with this, so she could do the job and get the information they needed. "We're on a tight schedule," Ellison said a bit more diplomatically. "Fair enough," he shrugged and turned to the bodyguard. "That will be all, Nikolai." The bodyguard left the room and closed the door behind him, leaving the three of them in privacy. "I don't normally have guests at my home," he told them, Better to keep work and home separate. What he really meant, Ellison knew, was that he didn't want to keep an arsenal of offensive weapons in his home. Chances were his children had little to no idea what he did for a living, and he probably wanted to keep it that way. "It's a very nice home," Ellison said. "Thank you," he smiled back. "I take it business is doing well." "That's why I asked you here," Malenkov replied. He pulled out a photograph and placed it on a dark oak coffee table between them. The photo showed a man in his 50s with lined, tanned skin, long dark hair tied into a ponytail, and dark, vengeful eyes. "This man," he said, "is giving me many headaches." "Who is he?" Savannah asked. "His name is Kevin Westinghouse. He was an associate of mine until he decided to set up his own business. The CIA suspect he's been supplying the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, but have no proof. Last month, he ambushed one of my shipments, killed 3 of my men and stole my merchandise. You're probably aware, James, that I'm not as straight an arrow as you. In my business, you have to be ruthless to survive." Ellison's eyes widened in realization as Malenkov spoke. "You want Savannah to kill him," he said, shaking his head. "We're not hit men." Savannah said nothing, but she wasn't too happy about being turned into a hired gun. She'd spent her whole life fighting, and now she wanted to put all that behind her and start again with a clean slate. "Not kill," Malenkov insisted. "This is not simply revenge. He has something of mine I want back. I want you to bring him to me." That didn't make Ellison any more relieved. He knew that behind his refined, polite exterior was a ruthless, lethal bastard who still dealt in illegal arms and likely other criminal activities the government were happy to ignore in exchange for his services. He knew full well what would happen to the man if they captured him and brought him to Malenkov. "Why can't you do it?" Savannah asked. "You've got plenty of guys here." She'd seen 3 and guessed he had plenty more where that came from. "He's very well protected," Malenkov told her. "He always travels with bodyguards in his car and more men in a second behind him. It's far more difficult to capture a man than kill him." "What is it exactly he's got that's so important?" Ellison asked. "That, I'm afraid, James, is a secret. If your own guys can't do it, what makes you think I'll be able to?" Savannah asked. The Ukrainian smiled knowingly. "Westinghouse is clever and very slippery, but he has one weakness: women. And you're very attractive. He has a penchant for high-class escorts, which he regularly indulges, and I want you to replace one of them so you'll be alone with him." Malenkov placed a small black plastic case on the table and opened it. Inside was a small glass vial containing a clear liquid and sealed with a foil top, like on the old milk bottles, Ellison noted. "What is it?" he asked. "Sodium thiopentothal," Malenkov explained. Next to the vial was a small, pen-like auto-injector. Insert it into the injector and stab him with it leg or backside is best if you can, and it automatically injects the mix into his bloodstream. It should take 10 to 15 seconds to either render him unconscious or at least render him paralytic. When you have him, bring him back to the warehouse, and I will tell you what you want to know in return. A frown furrowed Ellison's brow as he listened to Malenkov. He really didn't like this. He'd known that whatever favor the man would ask for wouldn't exactly be above board, but he was putting Savannah at extreme risk to do his dirty work. "One condition," Savannah said, leaning forwards in the sofa. "We need more weapons." Most what Ellison and Sarah had bought from him was now buried underground, and retrieving it would be difficult and dangerous. Grenade launchers, rockets, Semtex, and anything that fires armor-piercing rounds. "Done," Malenkov nodded his agreement. "He's hired an escort for tonight and is meeting her for a drink at a hotel in West Hollywood. I need you to intercept her and take her place." He stood up, indicating their meeting was over. "Nikolai will see you outside and give you the details," he said. "When do we get the information you promised us?" Ellison asked as he and Savannah stood up and opened the door, stepping outside of the living room. "I'll contact you later tonight. Once the job is done, I'll tell you what I know." "You'd better," Savannah told him. If he double-crossed them, then she'd use her considerable skills, as he put it, to make him regret it. Ellison might trust his word, but until he delivered the information on him, she wouldn't. Ellison followed her out, pulled out the cell phone Sarah had given her, and started to dial John's number. He wouldn't be happy about what the job was, but they had no choice.